Okay, cool. So just to be sure, Matt, we can start the round already, right? Okay, cool. All right. So without further ado, on the motion that we require educational institutions in wealthy countries with high numbers of international students to pay a percentage of those students' tuition to educational institutions in developing countries, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here, here.
Awesome. Can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
All right, amazing. I would prefer POIs in the chat, please. Three, two, one. As a debater who's unfortunately here representing both Yale and the West, fuck Yale and fuck the West. We're going to explain to you how we bring equity on our side of the house, first through principles of why we should do this, secondly, how redistribution helps these schools. Here's the model. We think this is a modest percentage of tuition, things like 10%. This is made correctly because we think it's going to be like a lot of the profit that you get from these students, but not all of the profit. We think this applies to students from low and middle income countries. Note that we'll give to public institutions in these developing countries, and that while most of these probably apply to tertiary institutions like universities, if it works for high schools too, we're okay with giving some of that to them if like someone from Columbia sends their kid to like Horace Mann. Also note that satellite schools whose central campuses originate in the West, like NYU Abu Dhabi and Yale and US, we think they should also pay these kinds of tuition due to their home country. Principle for why we should do this. First principle, educational institutions stole from the global South, and that's the only reason that they have this ability right now. Note that we are taking from a lot of these institutions that have two things. First, they are incredibly wealthy institutions, and secondly, they are normally private institutions in the West, things like Oxford, things like Yale. Why did these institutions literally build their legacy over these plunder of the global South? First, the founders and major donors directly profited from colonialism. That is to say, Eliya, the guy who donated to Yale, ended up funding these things, literally did it through exploitation of the state of Madras in India as a really shitty governor and did a lot of shitty things with the slave trade. Second, schools directly involved in these development of these institutions have harmed the institutions outside of these countries. This looks like the Chicago boys in the University of Chicago economics department implementing austerity programs that absolutely fucked up places like Chile and Uruguay and other places indirectly through infiltrating the IMF. Note that these people were only able to do this because of their affiliation with these universities, because that's what gave them the destroy the countries writ large, but it also destroyed education institutions specifically. That is to say, these austerity programs are the reason why Chilean public schools don't have any power in the system, assuming that the market would solve. So all of the rich people, like some of our from Latin America, just yeeted to the private American schools. Third reason why these institutions plundered. We tell you that these schools benefit directly from Western colonialism still. That is to say, the reason why people go to Yale from outside of the West is because they have a market advantage that is incredibly unfair because of the amount of time that they have had the ability to exist on our side of the house without plunder. That is to say, the reason why kids from outside the West go to these because they're seen as having better job opportunities. Because if you want the best education, it's been internalized that you have to go to the West. Note that none of these things are reasons why these schools are actually better. You will be a good engineer if you graduate from Bogota or if you graduate from Yale. On our side of the house, then I think at that point, the reason why they have this kind of clout is, first of all, internalizations from colonialism, and secondly, because they were able to stick around and not get fucked up by a British army boat on their side of the house. I think at that point, the impact is here that you steal kids from the global South in ways that are incredibly unfair. Note here, I want to be really clear, students only go to institutions on our side of the house with really large endowments. The reason for this is quite simple. If these schools didn't have a lot of really large endowments and a lot of opportunity, and they weren't the elite schools, which are private, these international students just simply wouldn't go there. They would go closer to home. They would, because this is first, closer to the people they love. Second, because it's cheaper. There's no transit there. Third, there's often no language barrier, which normally exists if you end up going to a Western country, if you're from a Western country. This means that what is the impact of this? We're only really going to be plundering the affluent schools on our side of the house and redistributing from them on our side of the house. These schools like Yale, on our side of the house, who have a lot of money, and B, fall into a lot of these harms. Second principle, really quickly, I just think it's really important to talk about the fact that regardless of what you believe actually informs human development, whether it's nature or nurture, whoever ends up getting to the best part, it's fundamentally arbitrary where you were born and the opportunities you were put into. So depriving people of these opportunities is fundamentally really wrong. Second, substantive, but before that, I'll take a POI from closing if they have anything. Nope. Cool. Okay. redistribution helps schools. First, I want to talk about the mechanism for how we get the redistribution. You're going to give them money from the tuition. I know it's really fancy, but it's in the model. It's pretty simple. I think that what this means is we end up giving money directly to the public education institution, the presidents of these universities who allocate these things, other things are actually needed. I think this means that you end up allocating towards scholarships, for example, if you know there are a lot of talented people who can't access your institution. I think it means investing in equipment, for example, you have competitive chemistry labs so you can get more chemistry students. I want to talk about one thing of this mechanism that's really important though, because notice the size of this money as it gets allocated to the developing world. That is to say, Yale costs $70,000 a single year, and if $7,000 doesn't get you all that far in New York City, it definitely gets you really far in Paraguay. What is the impact of this? We can win on this alone because the contribution means that we just put money into educational institutions where they do better work. Insofar as these are really, really good, and this money is back on their side of the house, we tell you that you should give it to them insofar as we can get these kinds of things. But actually, now that we've explained the mechanism, I want to be really quick what the cost is in status quo about these kids from international institutions, from low and middle countries, go to schools in the West. First, that means that these schools in the status quo from lower income countries often don't have the resources to meaningfully compete. They lack sufficient technology to make things work. They have enough microscopes or really advanced materials are really expensive, and the average informed voter does too. Second, they can't have good teachers because they can't afford to pay them as much. So this means that good teachers from places like Egypt get poached to the West. Third, they just can't afford things like internet access, and they can't provide the same things like alumni networks that are really important. I think this means you get a huge amount of brain drain in the status quo of people who are your most talented students. This means they might not come back to help communities, particularly incredibly important on our side of the house to have these kinds of institutions, or to have people there who are going to be able to contribute their activities directly to these kinds of places. You only get that if you end up staying in your country, and you only get that if you don't get socialized to somewhere else, which normally has a higher standard of living, A, but also B, probably ends up making friends there. You create ties there. You don't want to go back at that point. But that's really important. I want to be clear that losing these highest achieving kids to implement these institutions on our side of the house, or actually help these institutions grow clout in the short run. That is to say, what you need to do is you need to create institutions that in the long run in low income countries can actually attract smartest quote unquote kids and the most privileged kids to actually go to them, because that is how you end up getting success, not only during their actual school tenures when they do fancy things for you, when they win international competitions. So this means that the next time that there's a finale, they don't win for Harvard, but they win for their own country. But secondly, it also means that over the long durée, you get alumni from your university who actually succeed. The students who go to elite universities in the status quo are normally the ones who have the drive and persistence to do in careers. You want them going to institutions in the developing world, and you only get that if you give them a fuck ton more money. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to propose.
Here. Thank you very much to the excuse me. Thank you very much to the Prime Minister. I would now like to invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Let me get my timer. So I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. Firstly, why the international students, slots for international students, or accessibility to these institutions for international students is likely to be limited within their side of the house. Secondly, why this is inherently harmful for individual students on the ground, and why this is principally unjustified to utilize these individuals as a social battering ram. Lastly, even in the metric of development of local developing country, environment, why this is not counterproductive for the development of the developing country. All the rebuttals will be integrated into my speech. So firstly, why educational institutions in developed country are likely to accept less number of international students. Notice that in opening government, they cannot fear that these developed country institutions will maintain the number of slots that they have. This is unlikely for two reasons. Firstly, because the substantial proportion of money to the developing institution will automatically go away. Because this is an important revenue for these developed countries institution, they don't want the money away. That's why they have less incentive to use up, less incentive to accept more number of international students, because it means you need to give away money to a random institution. Second reason is because it's a random institution. Which means that which means that there's no mutual benefit, and because you are only giving money to a random developing country institution who has less appealing professors or researcher facility, which means that there's no benefit for this developed institution. B, how the money will be used is unknown. There's no leverage over how the money will be used, which means that the developing country random institution will take away that money. But C, the reason why this is a likely scenario, because the reason why these international students go abroad in the first place is because the local university or local educational institution is not that good. They don't have good facility, or they don't have good research or professor in the first place. That's why the money is likely to go to these institutions, which is likely to be not beneficial for these developed country institutions. The conclusion is that the number of international student slots is likely to decrease because you lose more by accepting more number of international students. But secondly, even if number of slots is ensured, the three structural reasons why the accessibility is likely to be lost. A, because they are likely to increase the tuition fee or the educational cost to these students to make it more expensive, so that they can make up for the loss. But B, because the scholarship is very limited, and the money and the resource that these developing country has in order to invest to these students is limited, which means that when the tuition fee gets more expensive for this developing country, the number of students that they can send to this developed country institution is likely to decrease. That's why the type of students who can go to international institution within their side of the house is very limited, and it's only the privileged individual who can go within their side of the house. Why is this harmful for the individual students? Firstly, because access to university is one of the essential source of agency and happiness for these people. A, because it becomes an important economic opportunity. Access to individual professors, access to human connectionship, access to famous CV and leverage is essential for you to get good economic opportunity and good economic jobs in good companies. But B, academic resource you can pursue within the developed country institution is much better. You are able to, or you have much more opportunity to pursue your research or pursue the professor or pursue the facility that you really want to pursue. C, which means that this is an important way of self-actualization avenue for these people to increase their happiness in life, increase their potential happiness and potential opportunity for their future life. That's why university is a prerequisite for these individual students' success in the future. Why taking this away from individual students is principally wrong. Firstly, because these students are born innocent. A, it is morally arbitrary that they happen to be born in the third world country. It is unfair for these students to be bear the harm. B, especially given that these students are young students who didn't have direct control over the responsibility and are not responsible for the political problem or economic imbalance that exists within the global. Why are you shouldering the burden to these individuals? Second, students are here because of their self-attained effort to pass the high-level exam, to get the scholarship in interview. This student made massive efforts in order to enter this developed country institution. It is unfair to take away this opportunity from these students. Government tried to say that this developed institution has the responsibility, but the specific principal questions that they need to answer is why it has to come from the tuition fee of these international students, which is likely to be harmful for these individual students' accessibility to their developed institution. Second, why this is actually counterproductive for the development of third world country. I'd like to respond here whether the money is effective and why the money is likely to be ineffective. Firstly, because of the bribery. A, because of colonialism and nepotism. So the type of students who can enter this local university is friends or family or politicians or people with power like CEO. But B, it is unaccountable. A, because media tends to be corrupt. controlled by the government. B, because the disclosure of information and how this institution is done tends to be unaccountable and it's very uncountable. C, because of the mutual dependence with each other. By keeping this institution corrupt, this family and friends, these politicians, and the president of academic institution is able to benefit. That's why they have incentive to keep this institution corrupt. But even if it's not corrupt, two structural reasons why it's likely to fail. Firstly, because they are inefficient. The reason why they are struggling in the first place is because they don't have the management or know-how, because their management is terrible or because their policy is something terrible. But second, there's likely to be moral hazard because you will automatically get the money even if you fail. That's why there's likely to be moral hazard in terms of how this money is likely to be used. Lastly, why international students decrease is actually harmful for the developing country on the ground. Firstly, because you take away the important trickle-down effects from these international students. A, because they have the specific skill and know-how that they were able to acquire through this developed country academic facility. B, because of things like ideology, liberation to spread freedom of expression or feminism is an important avenue for these students, are important avenue and medium to spread this kind of ideology to the whole country so that democratization can happen. But C, because of human connectionship with a talented individual across the globe. That's why, for example, Hungarian student who went to Germany come back home as a nurse that is able to contribute to the local industry, is able to contribute to the medical safety of the people on the ground, is able to contribute to the bureaucracy of the people on the ground. All of this is likely to decrease within their side of the house. They try to say brain drain is likely to happen. Firstly, local community and friends, you have people who attach communication to. That's why that's not necessarily true. But the second impact is you lose the contribution to the local development that these people can uniquely do. For example, Rwanda has this system of the diaspora where they provide things like social benefit from the funding that they were able to acquire from international students. All this kind of mechanism is lost within their side of the house when you decrease the number of international students in the first place. For all these reasons, we are extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Here. Thank you very much to the leader of the opposition. I'm happy to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah, sure. So there is a request to just switch the Wi-Fi in the chat. So let's just give them a minute to do so. Just let us know when you've successfully made this swap. Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, CG. So the Wi-Fi issue is solved. Deputy Prime Minister, whenever you are ready, the floor is all yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're on.
Amazing. They ignored a basic fact at the start of our case, which is that when you send $10,000 back from Yale to India, to Pakistan, to China, to another country in the global south, that $10,000 goes much further than it would in America. Particularly, firstly, because educational institutions are highly wasteful in America. When they talk about things like cronyism, they ignore the fact that literally, like many other countries, can provide educations for significantly cheaper than at particular educational institutions in the West, the ones with very high endowments that charge very high tuitions. So there's incredible waste of money that does not necessarily go to good services being provided. But the other thing is the purchasing power parity argument that Trent already made for you. That is, the $10,000 that comes from one student can effectively fund another student's education despite being 10% of one student's tuition. What that effectively means is that you can fund many, many more students' education under our side of the house, because really what that $10,000 does is it translates to the equivalent of like $50,000 in another country, meaning that actually you can probably fund multiple students with one student's tuition alone. So in the absolute best case for their side of the house, slightly fewer students get into Oxford, slightly fewer students get into Yale, but those students not being able to get in means that they are going to local schools, paying local tuition, supporting local universities, or when they go to those schools, which we think they overwhelmingly will still be able to do, they're paying some of that tuition back, bringing that money back. We think that's incredibly important in developing local institutions. There's a huge benefit under our side of the house. What is the path for victory for us? Firstly, we want to address the principled argument in this debate because we don't think that our argument has actually been addressed. That is, that these educational institutions, independent of other effects, have stolen directly from educational institutions in the global south, in the developing world, and as a result, owe a duty of obligation toward those institutions. And secondly, that even if you do not believe that that is the case, that we allow for better development of the global south. We do not think that the global south and their development should be measured at the top. We think that it should be measured by the opportunities afforded to the average citizen, not the one who is most likely to get into Oxford, which probably biases toward the elites within that country, the ones who are able to do things like get tutoring, the ones who are able to do things like fly over to other countries for interviews, the ones that are able to do elite test prep. We think that it's most likely that we get people under our side that, yeah, maybe don't have the same caliber degree as an Oxford degree, but are able to go out and become nurses, to become engineers, to contribute to the local bureaucracy and improve the functioning of that country. Those are the most important things. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick piece of rebuttal and then move into two questions in the speech. Firstly, on a quick piece of rebuttal on what the incentives for Western schools are. I don't think it's the case that Western schools are less likely to take students under, to take students from the global south under their side of the house. Why? Firstly, they still want these students because in many cases they are major cash cows. The fact is that in most cases, many students from the country themselves receive large educational benefits or pay lower tuitions as a result of government policies, for instance. And that means that international students often pay higher tuition when they do pay tuition. They are major cash cows. They donate money back. They're successful. But even if this is not true and they don't want students for this reason, these universities have $100 million to $1 billion endowments, right? They can take the financial hit if it insulates them from criticism. I think that this insulates them from criticism in a few key ways. Firstly, there's a general perception of fairness. That is that there could be things like lawsuits brought against them for discrimination against people from other countries, for discrimination against people of a particular race. But also within their own student population, they want their students to be happy with them. They don't want student groups and things like alumni networks to band together and have coalitions that form against them. Like, for example, international students organizations that do exist within these schools. Like, for example, alumni networks from particular countries that do exist in these schools. When these students get mad, it tangibly harms the reputation of the school, but also their ability to get alumni relations. That just means that alumni donations, which means that many of their most successful graduates, the ones that go off to become captains of industry in other countries, openly hate the school now and do not donate back to them. That's a crucial thing. They also care about perceptions of fairness. It's also very hard to reject these students on merits. I just think that they test well, and it's very difficult to bring a reasonable case for discriminating against them. Look, the absolute worst case, right? Slightly more wealthy kids from the global south don't make it, right? They'll have to go to PKU instead of Oxford. That is absolutely fine. PKU is a great school. They will have better opportunities under our side of the house. But the note is low-income students have more opportunities on our side of the house, not only because, firstly, look, they still get accepted at the same rates because they were never cash cows in the first place. So the tuition marginal difference doesn't make a difference for low-income students that are already receiving reduced tuition. But secondly, because low-income students within the country that cannot afford to make it out are getting better opportunities. The second part that I want to talk about is the two questions in the speech. Firstly, on the principle, I just think that it's horrible that schools that literally were founded by people like Eliya Yale, schools that have statues of Cecil Rhodes, still can say that they have absolutely no obligations to the countries that they plundered from. We think that their most direct obligations are to specifically the educational institutions within those countries. We think that's a clear and strong obligation Trent already brought to you, and that cannot be refuted by the other side and has not been refuted by the other side. But what do they say in response? They say, well, you take away the opportunity from students who might be able to go to these schools. The first thing that we say is that we think that this is legitimate because you are contributing to a corporation that has devastated and stole from educational institutions in the global south. Just because you are a member of the global south does not mean that you cannot be complicit in that. In fact, it is the fact that you are moving to the west in the first place that is the mechanism of that theft. So we think that it's reasonable to say, yes, we recognize some degree of autonomy and agency, but also to say that we need to discourage this and at least pay some form of reparations, which is to return some of that money which was achieved by theft. We think that that's absolutely appropriate. But second thing to point out is that we prioritize local students. To the extent that we care about the opportunities afforded to individuals, we think that we should care most about the opportunities afforded to individuals who do not have other options, who do not have a good quality of life otherwise. Given the individuals that would be rejected are only the rich individuals who are paying high tuition now, but would not be accepted now because of the marginally lower tuition, those are the individuals that we care least about in this debate. The second thing that I want to talk about is helping development, right? The first thing that they say is that money will be spent poorly. I just don't think this is the case. It's incredibly easy to track the particular flows of money that go to these educational institutions because now the developed world is tracking it too in the very first place because they want to be sure that the money that they're giving is used for good purposes. The developing world, for instance, knows that there will be scrutiny on the money that is used if it comes to the developed world now. But also, the things that they need are incredibly clear, right? There are clear short-term problems with schools in the global south. Things like lights going out in your university after a certain time because they cannot afford the bills. Professors teaching absolutely massive classes without TAs. No ability to do things like open labs. Third, even if there's cronyism, it's not like a 90% cronyism. Look, even if we get like less money money and some of it is spent poorly, we think that the vast majority of it is spent well. Does this cause brain drain? I just think that this is not following the population and what services they're actually providing. They need on-the-ground preparation under their side of the house. So yes, you might get slightly more consultants, but consultants don't come back to the country that they came from. Under our side of the house, we train people like nurses, engineers, bureaucrats that actually help local industry. That's a crucial thing. You need money to run schools well. That does not happen under their side of the house because tax flows simply do not go to these schools. For all these reasons, happy to propose.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister. To wrap up the opening exchange of today's debate, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Right. Am I audible and visible?
You are, but slightly soft. Is it possible to be a bit louder?
Does this sound better, or should I change the microphone?
This sounds way better. This is fine.
Okay. I'll speak in this volume.
Okay.
Right. It is very arrogant for side-opening government to assume that every individual who are able to go, that every international students are from a richer background that they're able to pay this tuition. One of my friend actually needed to go through 20s of application of scholarship and finally got one and able to go to the overseas university and actually study abroad to open up her whole future. She's from a single mother family and is under a massive debt. And only way for her in order to save her entire family is actually to go to overseas university and to get a actual decent job in order to save her own family. However, these kind of individuals are the one who are going to receive this biggest harm as a result of taking this proposal, which is why it was really ridiculous for the previous speaker to say, aha, or haven't responded to the principal argument. Because if you look into your note, all of the principal blame coming from opening government is directed to the university, not to the form of the victim that we were talking about from our side of the house. Given that moment, you cannot vote for opening government merely because they have failed to justify this very policy in the first place. But second thing we need to understand is that this motion is really nuanced. This motion requires you to collect money from a certain place. This motion isn't only about distribution of money, but it is more about where this money should come from. So theoretically, it is possible for opening opposition or as well as closing opposition to also counter-opt this argument, counter-opt this motion by also supporting donation by its university or funding from its university, which is not uniquely coming from the tuition of the international students, which is why it was ridiculous for you. Ridiculous for opening government to just pretend individual from the developing world, but I is personally going to deal with this justification and make it 100% clear that opening up is going to be taking over opening government. But secondly, I would like to talk about the incentive analysis of the university and make it super clear that the amount of the international students are likely to decrease under side of the opening government. The implication of the second argument is very important. If the number of the international students decrease, it means number one, that the whole amount of the money that the opening government asserted that will happen are going to decrease, because they're not going to be going in the first place. But second, for the reason that these international students are going to be going into domestic universities, those who are poor in that developing country are not going to be able to access university, because you know what? The previous speaker said, aha, they're going to pay tuition. That's good. But this tuition is also cheap. Hence, it is unrealistic to assume that the number of the individuals who can go to university are likely to increase under their side of the house. That is why ridiculous. But finally, let me argue this benefit to this developing country, because which opening government really wanted to argue on this. I'd like to tell you why it's counterproductive and on multiple layers. So first, on this principle. So as I have made it clear, the first argument from opening government does not make sense, because we are not defending the right of the university in the first place. We're talking about the vulnerable individual on our side of the house, which is why the only analysis that made sense from opening government is the analysis from Deputy Prime Minister that says, aha, these people have been a theft, they have stolen money, which is not engaging with what Toshiya said in the first place. Toshiya told you that these people didn't choose to be born in that situation in the first place. Why just because you're a theft doesn't really engage with this analysis? Since Toshiya gave you first, I think the DPM had the responsibility to tell us why we should be prioritizing their analysis over them. But I'm generous enough to engage with that argument still. So even if it is a theft, like number one, I didn't understand why is it a theft in the first place, right? Because yes, even if you are in a position of privilege, the way in which you are possible to make money is only by benefiting the society, inventing new technologies, providing job to individual, and that is the only ways in which you are able to gain money. Which is why the fact that you are receiving money at that moment already proves that you gave a massive benefit to the society. Because in a capitalistic society, money means the amount of the benefit that you have given to the society. You can't just assume it is a theft and say that, they have killed many people. That's in fact not true in many cases. But second, let's talk about the individual who we are focusing on the most, the poorest individual who are going to be denied of the access to go to university. Are these people theft? I will say it's absolutely not. For that reason, there are multiple exceptions, and especially the character who are going to be influenced the most are the one who are most likely not the theft. I think this principal argument does not make sense. For this reason, OG failed to justify this argument. Hence, I think closing government needs to come back with this point. So second argument about this analysis of the university incentive and whether they will try to maintain the number of the international students, which is the key premise for OG's case to stand. Now, the rebuttal I've heard from Deputy Prime Minister was that these people are still cash cows, thus they want to they want to continue to have this international students. And second, they talked about this alumni and they will fear the welfare of the university students. The firstly on this issue about cash cow, if you assume that cash cow is still going to continue, then probably you aren't reading this motion because you are decreasing the margin of the profit and you're asserting the percentage of this margin is going to be really small. This does not make sense, which is why it's a massive contradiction. But secondly, let's go on to this university incentive analysis. So what is happening right now in the United States or many of these developing countries? So the domestic individuals are massively sort of xenophobic against, let's say, Asian individual because they are taking over the slots of studying in university and whatnot, which is why international students are kind of charged way more so that they will be beneficial to their own university. This was the only compromising point between the domestic citizens, US citizens, and in between the international students, which is why if the profitability of the international students decreases, that is the moment in which that there are going to be less incentive for university to continue to have this lot of the international students, because the local individual are also going to be mad about this point, which is why it is very likely to assume that university also want to decrease the number of this international student. They all finally talked about this issue about this alumni, but number one, I think this is pretty assertive in the first place, right? Because I think the priority of the university is to satisfy the current customers, not the future fluffy gain. But second, even if that is the case, I think it is something I think because you are going to be having other sort of alumni as a result of kicking out international students, I think you can still be able to the university will still be able to gain benefit. For that reason, I don't think this is a likely analysis from their side of the house. Finally, benefit to the developing country, which is an engagement with the best case from opening government. So opening government asserted, they will be able to fix lights and give machines. Toshiya gave you analysis as to why this is not going to be beneficial for the overall development in the first place because of the rig structure within this developing country. Literally no response. You cannot just simply buy opening government's analysis for that reason. But even if you assume that is the case, still Toshiya gave you multiple layers of analysis as to why it's going to be harmful. One, because you lose funding from these individuals, but two, literally in money transfer from these international students, but also the trickle down of the technology and skills. We have proven to the example of Germany and Hungary, or let's say Filipino individual studying abroad, which massively benefited Philippines at the end of the day. For all that reason, but finally, we think accessibility is going to be denied. Of the local students, accessibility are going to be denied because these smart students will come in, will go into the domestic university. Hence, they're going to deny the vulnerable accessibility. For all that reason, we literally win over this vulnerable class. Thus, you should vote for opening up.
Here. Thank you very much, Sir Deputy Leader of the Opposition. That effectively concludes the opening exchange. To begin the closing exchange, I'm happy to invite the member of the government. Here.
Amazing. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, cool. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please recognize developing countries are slowly reaching a deadlock. In all of the areas that you can possibly be competitive in the global market, I think developing countries who mostly now 90% of them focus on infrastructure, agriculture, are necessarily failing. The only way that you can barely save these people's lives, the ones that are not privileged enough to go to fucking Cambridge, is that you can actually offer them something better in their own home cities, right? I think the only way that you can actually do that if you create a slow tipping point in terms of them turning more to the academic mindset, tertiary sector, etc. So to not keep losing people. No, this is a long-term process. This is a process that's going to happen probably for a long number of years for people to change their mindset and think there's something valuable for reinvesting in their own home cities. But this is the only way that you can actually reach some sort of a benefit, right? Because at that point, everything you get on the top half is some people are leaving, some people are coming back, some people are giving money. Well, it's not that much of a money, right? I think it's all practically a wash. The only thing that can win this debate to actually put the long term for the people on the ground that are stuck in these countries that cannot get out is that they could possibly have a better life. This is why closing government is going to win by forwarding two sets of claims. One, we're going to basically respond to one assumption that entire OO case relies on, of basically this not being accessible and making it very difficult for them to get out. Agency on the codependent on that. And then secondly, talk to you about the metric of exclusivity, what it means in debating, and how you're actually going to win by proving that something actually works. Firstly, to make it very clear, principle from opening government is contingent on these developing institutions actually benefiting from these investments on the people they were harmed. Their entire, I think they say they have three principles, but basically one is a reciprocal assumption, right? We screw them over, so we help them. Know that you can only credit this sort of a part of the debate, way too many minutes spent on the opening half, if you can actually prove that the people that you harmed in the past with your colonialism and exploitation is the one that you can actually going to help have better lives 10 years down the line. We're going to also win on that. Dealing with OO, right? Know that everything that they say about this being terrible is contingent on them assuming now this means less international students are going to go there because either A, they're going to raise their tuition fees, it's going to be difficult to go, they're going to stay at home, or they're going to cut on scholarships. So you have four responses to this. One, I genuinely think that the people that are actually privileged enough in a developing country, probably coming from a very stable like family, or the ones like their brothers went to like LSE or whatever, are probably the ones that can still afford it, right? I genuinely don't understand why, as I think OG model in, like let's say, well, 10% in tuition fees, if you're, I don't know, Harvard, Yale, is actually going to make that huge of a difference for the people that probably are already going to make this decision anyway. Secondly, the ones that are taking some sort of scholarships, right? The reason why I think they can still afford the tuition fee, even as the price goes up, is because realistically, most of these scholarships actually come from other actors, not these universities specifically now, right? Like the EU, NGOs, etc. Right? I think. Sorry, my dad is calling. Look, I think the reason why that happens is because obviously because of this like international optics and the cosmopolitanism from 2 days ago, right? Is because we sort of created this mindset of sort of helping, right? You literally have like EU laws that are in certain universities regulating the need to help disprivileged students, right? These are the ones that are like the Euroscholar projects or things like that who want to like help certain students get into certain universities. Very often, unfortunately, it's not these universities. We're going to explain to you why, right? Thirdly, I think there's public pressures, general universities everywhere, specifically in the West, being ridiculous with tuition fees. Young people are a significant voting bloc. Know what happened in America, but everyone turning to Bernie because people are realizing that it's really fucking expensive. And one of the like tipping points that are going to become in elections is the young people who are actually realizing they want a better life even in the West, but they cannot afford it, right? I also think that generally, fourthly, as I've said, high-class universities are interconnected already with underprivileged areas generally because of optics, right? Know that prestigious universities that join educational EU programs are setting up quotas for specific underprivileged groups or have like discounts on tuition fees because they have this exchangement and have that like agreement a long time ago, right? Such as the Trinity has a quota for like Albanian students, etc. Right? I think you cannot automatically assume therefore that just because that is completely correct in proving these people are going to be screwed, therefore, we are completely fucking up people's agency, this is terrible, this doesn't work. Look, how does this then work? How do we know we're opening government? Why is this uniquely the best solution as opposed to any other alternatives? Note that OO, or generally OP here, is running a negative case, right? I never heard from them what is the positive trend in the status quo or helping, or how these students actually having a better life, except some people send money home and I guess, well, that tax gets taxed and I will build a new Cambridge in Bangladesh. I'm not sure what exactly their positive trend here is. We're going to win on exclusivity because we're going to prove to you that any other thing basically doesn't work, and this does for unique reasons. One, I think how we redistribute aid in the modern era is mostly by urgency, right? So the extent to which we have foreign investment in developing countries, it either goes to like specifically helping like I don't know, the poorest people, things that seem most urgent in charities, or generally investing in like their specific things that make them special, or just like buying their oil or investing in their infrastructure for China, etc. Secondly, I think universities in majority of the cases don't actually fund specifically their competitors to a significant extent so you can actually beat them, right? For you to still be a prestigious university that everyone wants to go to, you need to have like the best research as Oxford, you need to be the prestigious and all these things, right? It's never in your interest to actually help anyone or the countries, let's say developing countries that are on the rise, and specifically now also invest in them and have Bangladesh compete with you, right? I think that is not one of their main incentives. No. Thirdly, reinvestment from these developing countries into the universities now doesn't happen because their academic identity not being developed because it's too difficult, and they're already sort of tied to believing that it's much more easier. They're going to get some sort of money or being competitive in infrastructure and agriculture, but it obviously doesn't work anymore, right? Because what is happening is that China is investing in all of your infrastructure and bringing their workers. You do not get to have your own workers, right? Like Russia, who's already going to be more competitive on oil, USA and EU, they're literally dumping all of their agriculture onto them, literally like lowering their own prices because they cannot even be competitive in the agricultural sector enough, right? These are all the areas in which these countries need to necessarily focus on a tertiary sector, right? STEM academics, like research, tech, doctors, teachers, etc. So either they do not go out, or then they have to rely on these new like Western people that have high like academia going there, which are also highly expensive thing, right? Look, I think money usually comes with certain conditions. Like you are probably ensure to a trustworthy institution, this money goes specifically to them, right? But also know that I think you can still be to an extent shady and corrupt, but also have the main incentive of monetarily of country prospering, right? I think you can be corrupt, but also not completely dumb to know that you probably have to invest in tertiary sectors. If I can also make this analysis as a dumb 21-year-old, right? What I think this probably means is that you're over time changing the perception, right? Because now that you see that it's actually happening, right? You hear about this on the news, you hear that there's some sort of a positive projection that you actually have something to offer to the world, but specifically what you have and not the people that are going away. These are the things like physically seeing like a plaque in front of the like university that you like grown up next to, right? Hearing your brothers who go to your own local university say how they have like good research, they have good professors, and that they enjoy their experience, that you're more likely to stay there, right? It takes a long time to build the academic identity and the trust in these countries that I can actually pull through, right? But know the long term, this is the only way in which they can actually be competitive. Top half locks them in, either being too competitive, going away, you never get anything from these people, or generally just never giving them any reason to actually be more competitive. Please vote closing government.
Here, here. Thank you very much to the member of the government. I would now like to invite the member of the opposition. Here, here.
She's gonna come in a second. She went for some water.
No worries.
Okay, I'm here if you're also ready. What the fuck? Sorry, the Windows light's very bad, but anyways. I'm audible, right? Because
Yep.
if I'm, it will be sad. Okay. Starting 3, 2, 1. We accept the challenge from site closing governments to provide explanation and reasons why universities can be competitive without this money. But before that, I will frame the debate a little bit. Then I will explain to you why we are unfairly harming and worsening the condition to all students, and then moving to our extension. If I have the time, I will engage later. Starting off with the reframing of this debate, we believe that firstly, this debate is not only about Oxford and the Bangladeshi school or Harvard, whatever. We believe that we believe that students in these elitist institutions are going to be privileged anyway. We don't care that much about them because these are only like 5% of the whole universities in the world. We're talking about universities such as, I don't know, Surrey, Warwick, Essex, other mid-tier universities in the world. We believe that they are the huge percentage percentage of universities that are actually going to pay this fees or stuff. And we believe that this is very unfair for the average people, because notice why especially these universities are in the debate. Because we believe that generally average international students are not super privileged. These are people whose parents have been, gathering money for years so that they can go to kind of okay school. And why do they prefer to go in an average school? And why do they actually go? Because first of all, it's cheaper to live there, or in some cases in America, the fees are just smaller. Secondly, it's easier to enter. There's less competition for these places. So most probably the huge amount of international students are not going to Harvard, surprise. And why it is bad to harm especially these mid-tier schools? Because first of all, they have invested years and years to preserve themselves and not to die from competition. Secondly, they have invested a lot of resources in marketing so that they can attract these international students. Thirdly, they're also trying to compete with Oxford. They are not, they are not the Bangladeshi school, but they are also suffering from the fact that Oxford is trying to abolish them. So we believe that this is very important framing. Now let's move on to why we're making the conditions worse. We can assume that perhaps the government's frame is kind of okay and is working, and that the fees will just become higher. However, when we're talking about mid-tier universities, we believe that generally these students that are going there are not super rich. So for them, they're 10% are 10 reasons not to go to this university because it's fucking expensive. So the most plausible scenario for these schools, we believe, is that these 10% will just be taken from their current tuitions and they'll keep the level of the tuitions. Instead, they'll try to cut costs. And this will come at the expense of worsening the conditions of these universities. So what can go wrong? Firstly, they can cut the professors' payment. They can make them pay less, and thus the professors can get demotivated to present the material in the most clear and interactive way and to be as interesting as possible. Secondly, they may not be able to provide a good platform for especially for online teaching. They might not be able to buy, Zoom or make interactive math notes lesson. This happened to my university. I don't know about you, but I'm in a very weird university that doesn't have money. Thirdly, they can not invest that much of material in libraries to buy books for their students, which is important intellectual property and resource. And lastly, they can limit the practical exercises because they can't afford to buy labs and stuff. So why is this unfair? This is unfair firstly to national students who do not have any fault. Their only fault is that they chose this specific kind of okay institution. Secondly, this is unfair for international students. For instance, international students that come from, Bangladesh, that we are trying to help. We're trying to help these people actually get better education. However, by worsening the condition or making them pay more, we are not helping them either way. Thirdly, we are harming parents because they pay money to receive a specific service for their child. When we are depriving them of the quality of this service, then the free market fucks up. Fourthly, we believe that we hurt most probably the mid-tier or kind of shitty universities because they already have to compete with high-level institutions, and now we are just harming them to do it even more properly. But now let's get into the extension. Before that, whoever has a question, you on the camera, go on.
Yep. Even if universities didn't already have incentives to not piss off their existing alumni bases, this policy only affects the rich kids who pay full tuition. If you can save up tens of thousands of dollars to pay this tuition, you are not poor or middle class.
Okay, but we believe that there are like a lot of credits that you may take in order to go to these schools. I don't know, I can be middle class and take credits, or my family can, get their money all their life in order to send me. I don't have to be turbo rich. Lastly, let's go to the efficiency. This is the most important case. We believe that opening are kind of correct because management can be shit. But what are the reasons why the management of these universities can be shit? 3 reasons. Firstly, the less critical mass in the people to call out bad practices. Second, the corruption of this management in developing countries. And lastly, generally, these institutions are not a huge priority to invest in. So why we become much more competitive on our side of the house? Because first of all, when you don't have this funding, you are not dependent. You depend on this money. When you provide funding like 10% every year, you get the feeling that, oh, I'll get the money regardless. I don't have to do much better shit. Most probably, I'll just buy a better car. And this is the case in the developing world. So when you have less and less people coming to your university in the developing country, then you have an incentive to actually improve the stuff that you can do. And we don't think that there's only money that is important here. We have very much other alternative regardless of money. For instance, they can start realizing that they have to have more effective management and they have to manage their resources better. Secondly, they can adopt a better, a better, more interesting majors, more innovative, that are more demanded by the world's market, such as, business and communication instead of philosophy. The next one, we believe that they can develop a better attitude towards these students, because trust me, in the developing countries, the attitude is absurd, and they can make the lessons much more interactive because they have to compete, because they have to survive, and this is the most important incentive. Because when you're in the corner and you don't have anywhere to go, then you start acting. But even if the worst case, you really need money, here are a couple of alternatives that are, because we don't believe that generally educational institutions are those that have to pay reparation because of colonialism. A couple of alternatives for you. First of all, we have foreign aid from other governments. So the other governments that's also faulty, that is actually faulty of, colonialism, may start to send foreign aid. Secondly, the whole government can invest in this, because government from these local universities are the one to blame. They have not invested enough in the first place. Thirdly, you can send tutors, students for summer practices, and start international exchange projects in these places in order to improve the situation or exchange academia and materials. For all these reasons, we believe that we are the only thing that provides you efficiency and how these universities will survive, and that's why you should vote for us.
Here. Thank you very much to the member of the opposition. I would now like to invite the government whip. Here.
Just to check, you can hear me fine?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. Let me set up my notes. I would like POIs in the chat, please. Then I can get started. Okay, great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, opening government only exists if they prove that this is the best and only way to pay these countries. And this is what opening opposition calls them on, and I'm going to talk about this later. But the idea is that if this mechanism is not exclusively the only way to get these countries more developed and the only way to pump monies into universities, none of the thing stands. You cannot, because there are then better ways of fulfilling that principle. But also that means that oppositions in this debate had the burden to prove that there is a viable alternative. Here's the thing, and this is the most important thing that Olja brings to you. In the status quo, no one invests directly in these universities because it's not perceived as urgent, or it is not perceived as beneficial for the developed countries, etc. Or when developed countries do not have the money to do so because they have more urgent stuff. This means that it is less likely that you're going to have that these countries are going to be able to get out of being that deadlock of being stuck in agriculture, stuck in only industry, etc. Because when they're stuck in that, they cannot become developed. They're constantly getting exploited. They're constantly unable to break into the middle class. This policy is a unique tipping point because it's the only policy that we can directly invest in universities. Okay, 3 parts of my speech. 1, closing opposition, taking out of the debate. Secondly, opening opposition, some direct rebuttal, and helping OG stay relevant in this debate. And then thirdly, our extension and why is the most important thing. So closing opposition. I think closing opposition tries to do something smart. And they honestly did not think of this, but it doesn't work. And this when they try to reframe this debate and say, oh, but this is actually about mid-tier university, right? This is about Warwick's, Essex, etc., etc. And this is unfair to those universities because this hurts them. Okay, so here's the thing. 1, I think that Olja in a way preempts this even without expecting this is coming. When she tells you that, look, but a lot of this tuition money will keep coming anyways, because the scholarship money does not come from developing countries. It comes from the European Union trying to bait students in. It comes from NGOs trying to do, and charities trying to get students in. And it comes from these universities trying to get as many students in, right? And to them, a small increase in tuition fee isn't that much, but it is a lot of money in those developing countries. But even if I have to accept that to a certain extent, these mid-tier universities are hurt, I'm willing to trade that off. Because if it means that we are going to be able to help universities in developing countries, they are still the ones that we have to prioritize more because they're less likely to break out. But secondly, then Xiao tries to say, oh, look, but there are like other ways we can try to help them without making them dependent on money. Here's the thing that they don't realize. The alternatives they mention don't work because you need funding for all of those. To have enough of an attractive repertoire to get foreign students and foreign exchanges, you need money to do so, right? But the thing is that it's better to be dependent on someone's money than not have money at all, right? So I think closing opposition is out at that point. What happens to opening opposition? I think there are two main sets of claims. One, they say, oh, now less underprivileged students go to developed countries, this is bad. And OG to this says, oh, but they can stay home. Here's the thing. Olja then responds to this again with a great characterization. She says, one, in the status quo, those that can afford tuition, those can probably afford it anyways because they're rich as fuck, or they're so privileged that I don't fucking care if this guy cannot go to Oxford, but he has to go study somewhere else. Probably going to study to Warwick if it's that, so maybe those mid-tier universities don't suffer. But secondly, because of the analysis I gave to you before, those that get scholarships through excellent grades, etc., don't lose those. We don't lose many of those because that money comes from the outside that can afford the higher tuition fee. But what's the comparative then where opening opposition loses? It's because opening opposition loses because they don't realize that the people that they actually trade off are those that are never going to be able to go study outside, never going to be able to study abroad. We then win when we point out to you that if we get just a little bit more funding in those countries, that means you can expand your quota by 5 members, have 5 more scholarships for your domestic students. You get people who wouldn't go to university, but are now going to university. And these are the ones that are the most underprivileged, therefore the most important in this debate. Secondly, opening opposition says, oh, but this money should come from somewhere else. And here we're going to mechanize opening government to a certain extent. Because opening government, so what does OO mean by this? They say that, oh, like we should maybe mandate all universities to donate money. Like it should be independent on the amount of international students. But the only way opening government's principle works is because the amount of international students you have is proportional to the extent you're benefiting from developing countries. Not by colonialism, but in the status quo, to the extent that you're taking away excellent students from those countries, right? This means that no other metric and no other way is the one you should use when deciding how much money to mandate to give away, because this is the metric of how much you're benefiting from those countries and therefore how much reparations you should pay. Before I go on, opening up.
Right. Tell us, why is it justified to lock people in their own country, even if it is beneficial for the development, which, by the way, I don't think you have proved. We proved the opposite.
Okay, please, look. For that statement, you have to prove the promise that a sufficient amount of people get locked in. I told you that the ones that get locked in are the ones that are the most privileged. But for every single person I lose, I get more scholarships from those that went, that you can afford for them to stay and study at home. The harm isn't that great. But what is great? The thing is that in the status quo, there is no way to actually invest in those universities. Why? Because one, developing countries do not have the money they have has to be spent either on military to not die to terrorists or to keep power, or it has to be spent on like basic healthcare or basic welfare. If that's the case, developing countries cannot invest in themselves. Secondly, like foreign aid does not go there because one, it's not beneficial to you, because if those universities improve, they compete against your own universities. But secondly, even if it's not financially incentivized, you probably want to invest in like poverty and stuff like that that's more emotionally empathetic to you. This is a smart investment, but not the one that gets made. Why is this then important? Because this motion specifically gives money to other universities. This means that this is the only way to actually increase the amount of people who have academic education, who have tertiary education. This means that more and more people have a chance to start a business. They have a chance to actually get a job that takes them to the middle class, that allows them to compete on the global economy. Because to the extent where you only have agriculture or industry, you are going to be exploited by the West. The only way for a chance to break out of that long term is to build up your academia. This motion exclusively helps them in that. This is a justified goal. Vote closing government.
Here. Thank you very much to the government whip. To end this debate as a whole, I'm happy to invite the opposition whip. Here.
Just checking, I am audible.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you. I prefer questions through the chat, and I'm going to start in a couple of seconds. Panel, isn't it refreshing to take a breath in the real world while we listen to Xiao? We're so sorry that other teams didn't decided to take this debate to debate land. Now, let's see some of the responses of CG to what we give you as reframing. They're telling you, oh, mid-tier universities aren't here. Why so? We don't know. The motion in no specific instance tells you we are only talking about prestigious universities. We're talking about all university. Eliya fucking gives you explanations why they're the most important in this debate. Firstly, because most international students go to them because it's easier to get in. Like, no matter how much I study, I'm most probably gonna be not gonna get into Oxford, so I'm gonna settle going to Exeter or somewhere else where I again would get a foreign diploma I can use for my work life. See that this again exists in the debate. Like, most of the people that we're talking to are gonna be people that either can't get into other universities or can't afford it, so they go to the cheaper American university, or they go to Exeter, to Essex, pay less because it's cheaper there, or at least work in while they're in Essex and still study. So we don't think this reframing works. The only attack of CG panel is, oh, the EU gives you money. Sure, the EU gives money to Indians, the EU gives money to people from Africa, the EU gives money for me to study in the UK, even if it's not in the EU anymore. Super realistic. But now, let's go further on. Their main case is, oh, we need the money for our local universities to be better off. They don't explain why this will incentivize people to go back. Like, your own opening government tells you most people go to foreign universities not because they're better, but because they're widely known, because of the name, because of the prestige, because you can get a better job. So like, we don't care if you get more money. We don't think that the prestige from opening governments is gonna just magically disappear. But moving on, what we give you money doesn't fucking matter, and they don't engage with it. And with this, we fucking beat them on the get-go. Now, let's go over the other teams in this debate. Firstly, starting with opening government. While rebutting them, I'm gonna explain how we also go opening opposition. Opening government try to give you the idea that institutions bad. They take money from bad people. They have obligation. See that opening opposition don't respond effectively. If I do, we go over them. They give you two things. First, legacy. See that they don't explain why me taking money from a bad person makes me complicit in the bad thing he did. So if my father steals from someone and gives me allowance, this doesn't mean that I was a part of that crime, a part of that theft. So we don't think that this stands in the debate. Oxford may have taken money from a lot of people. We don't care where those people took their money from, because Oxford wasn't complicit in their crimes. Secondly, they do try to prove a direct harm though. They give you one only example. Oh, like they did austerity measures in Chile. Okay, one example doesn't equal analysis. See that even if Oxford had some ideas about austerity measures, it didn't make politicians put in these measures. We don't see why Oxford is fault. See, even if Oxford is at fucking fault, they still are a lot of other ways for Oxford to give back. They give scholarships, they give free courses on the internet, they give better ideas. Like the biggest university, no thank you, right now are making the idea why colonialism was wrong, why we should give retributive measures. And these are ways Oxford and other very good universities give back to the people they probably have harmed if they harm them. These responses you don't hear from us. We win this clash. But see that further on, when we reframe this debate and only talk about and also talk about mid-tier university, the principal harm shifts. Now you're talking about underprivileged institutions as Essex that are also competing against the privileged institutions. So that harm now is also on underprivileged institutions. You're also talking about underprivileged people that are going into these institutions and now are receiving less and less good accommodation, less courses, but worse off teaching because the institutions need to cut off some of their funding to give to other underprivileged institutions and other places. No, thank you. Now let's go over their. They try to give you also like a practical argument, which is why people would stay in their own country. This is something CG later on tries to elaborate on. See that again, the framing they give you that you only go because of the fame of the university would not make you now want to stay in your own fucking country. You may want to go to a foreign university just because of the social circle, just so you can study a new language, just so you can gain more experience and stuff like that. CG.
Right. The point isn't that more people will stay instead of going to Harvard. The point is that the ones that stay, you will now have better education and more people can get education.
Okay, so see that again, the idea of you staying doesn't work because it's worse off because as we're saying, if you're only going for the name, if you're only going for the prestige, and we think a lot of people do it just because of the social pressure. Like a lot of people immigrate and they don't want to go and try different universities as well. And this is even worse off when those universities have to either pick up their loans or give less quality education. And this is bad because now you have to go into even bigger student loans, or now you get less scholarships and less internships, which fucks up your life, which makes you more incentivized to stay in the foreign country so you make more money and you can pay off the bigger loans you had to take out. And these are specific negative implications. Again, only CEO give you. And with this, we also attack the practical arguments from opening opposition. But like, let's go over now. Again, an attack of CG, they tell you, oh, but money matters. Money matters. You don't have any change on your side. And this is how we again beat OO, because OO are right. Like institutions are probably going to be fucked up. They're going to be corrupt. They mismanage money, but they don't explain how things get better. And this is how we win this debate. It's very simple, panel. We don't only care about money because you have other instances. You have things like just bettering your interactions with people. This means that now my shitfuck university in Sofia has to make more presentations. It has to make us make essays. It has to give us internships so it can compete with other universities that are stealing their students. It can secondly get rid of bad teachers that are part of the regime because it realizes that those teachers are making others immigrate to get better teaching methods. It can also like give extracurriculars. It can try to boost its PR. There are a lot of implications how you don't need money to better the things and the quality of your education. CG don't engage with this. Only we give you this, and it's fucking factually true. We win this debate, panel. Now, moving on to something a last trade-off. See that even in the fucking best case of governments, where people are leaving the country and our universities are losing people, okay, what will happen? Probably 1 or 2 universities will close. We are okay with that harm because now the ones that are left can get more money from the government, more foreign investment, or can just take all the small sprinkled university students, put them in one place, get the tuition fees from all those university students, and again give better education through presentations, to more internships, and through other ways that don't necessarily need that much money. This is how you get better education, panel. This is how you get all the impacts of people staying in their country, people contributing to their country. Panel, we think that by taking this debate in the real world, we win it, and we hope you see this as well. We hope you vote for closing opposition.
Sure. Thank you very much to the opposition whip. That ends today's debate. Thank you all so much for your wonderful showing. All the best for the results. Yeah, you may leave the breakout room. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Amazing debate.